Let's break down 8 players that are going to go nuclear moving into week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. These are players that we cannot bench this week because the upside is way too high. Their matchups are way too good. And ultimately, they are going to help you dominate week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. Let's kick the video off with James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals in a smash matchup against the Miami Dolphins run defense. This defense has given up the 29th most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. And I just feel like James Conner still being a little bit undervalued here at the midpoint of the fantasy season. He is the RB11 currently in fantasy football. He has 14 or more fantasy points in every game this season except for 2. And those 2 came against pretty good run defenses in the Lions and the Packers. This is the Dolphins. This run defense has been getting gashed all season long. And Conner's coming off a week 7 performance against the LA Chargers, a pretty good run defense themselves, where he had 18.2 fantasy points, 19 touches last week, 101 rushing yards, and added 2 receptions for 51 receiving yards. This is a nice opportunity against a Miami Dolphins offense that might look a little bit different this week for, going up against the Arizona Cardinals. And overall, this game script could be a lot more competitive in terms of what we've gotten out of the Dolphins the past couple of weeks. So if you own James Conner, he's one of these players you may have drafted later. He's averaging 14 fantasy points per game. At this point in the season, he does not belong on your bench this week. He is set to have a huge week against the Dolphins. Do not bench James Conner here in week 8. All right, sticking with last week's matchup between the Chargers and the Cardinals, let's talk about J.K. Dobbins, who's coming off of one of his softer fantasy performances on the season, just 9.6 fantasy points against a bad Cardinals run defense. Pretty disappointing, just 40 yards on the ground, 3 catches for 26. Receiving yards, 9.6 fantasy points. But this week, he gets the New Orleans Saints at home. This run defense has just been god-awful in their past 2 performances. They just got completely gashed by Javonte Williams on Thursday Night Football. And the week before that, Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker had their way with this defense. So overall, I think Dobbins in a run-first offense that I will admit, the Chargers offense has its problems overall, and they're starting to become a bit one-dimensional, although we did see Justin Herbert throw the football quite a bit this past week, but it feels like overall this team is becoming a little bit one-dimensional, so I do have my concerns about them, but this is the heartbeat of that offense. He still had 14 touches last week. It was a weird game script on Monday Night Football. I think J.K. Dobbins at home this week is going to be the vocal point of the offensive game plan. I think he's going to be just fine. This is a smash matchup against the Saints. The Saints are becoming one of these defensive units that we want to start running backs against on a weekly basis. So J.K. Dobbins still averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season so far. If you own J.K. Dobbins, don't leave him on your bench this week. He should be in line for a massive week 8 performance. Next up is Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. We just mentioned having a big week against the Saints in week 7, 26.1 fantasy points, his best fantasy performance of the season so far. 14 touches, 88 yards on the ground, 6.29 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns, and added 3 catches for 23 receiving yards. And this week, he gets the Carolina Panthers, the worst run defense in all of the NFL and in all of fantasy football, allowing the most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. So essentially every single week we've been looking at what running back is playing the Panthers, and we have been considering them a must start. So we'll keep this pretty simple. Javonte's still been pretty good overall in the season. I know it's been kind of up and down, but he's had 11.1 fantasy points per game. Smash matchup here, coming off of a game where he had a tremendous outing. He's had pretty good overall volume in the past 4 weeks, except for week 6 against the Chargers. And even in that game, he was still involved in the passing game. I mean, he has 3 or more catches in every game since week 2, except for week 4 against the Jets. So if you own Javonte Williams, don't overthink it. He should not be on your bench. He's a great flex play this week. He's a great RB2 this week. He should not be on your bench. He is set to go nuclear against this Panthers run defense. And I would be going straight to Underdog to take the over on Javonte Williams to score a touchdown this week. We've been doing this almost on a weekly basis, looking at what running back is facing the Carolina Panthers and taking their over on the rushing yards or the over on them to score a touchdown. And for the most part, it feels like it's hit every single week. So head straight to Underdog, take the over on Javonte to score a touchdown this week. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code The Catch are going to receive a free NFL Pick Em for Week 8's action. So take your free Pick Em, take the over on Javonte to score a touchdown, and automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, next up is James Cook of the Buffalo Bills, coming off of a bad fantasy outing against a tough Tennessee Titans run defense in Week 7, just 9.2 fantasy points. He did score a touchdown, but just 32 yards on the ground, 12 touches, 2.67 yards per carry, his worst mark in terms of yards per carry so far on the season. But James Cook has still been very good overall in the season. I mean, he's missed one game on the year, and he's still averaging 15.6 fantasy points per game. He's still a top 15 running back in fantasy football. And this is a great matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the running back position. And I'm expecting on top of that, a good overall game script here. I'm expecting some points between the Bills and the Seahawks. For the most part in the season, the Seahawks are allowing these games with good game scripts where they're falling behind and their defense is allowing for points. So overall, I like the matchup here, like the game script. Everything about James Cook here should line up for a solid fantasy performance. If you own him, don't worry. I know some James Cook owners a little bit worried because Ray Davis had the good outing in Week 6 when Cook was out, and then had a pretty good game last week as well, but he only had 5 touches and 1 catch. He just turned that into 41 yards, a touchdown, and 6 total receiving yards for 11.7 fantasy points. So yeah, I mean, Ray Davis will probably be involved as the season goes on and continue to try and spell James Cook and keep him healthy, but this is still James Cook's backfield at the end of the day, and he's still a very good start if you own him. Don't overthink it. He should not be on your bench in Week 8. Moving along, let's take a look at a couple wide receivers, and let's start with Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers in a smash spot against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, it's worth mentioning that Reed is dealing with an ankle injury at the time I'm recording this, so monitor that as the week goes on, but I think he'll be good to go. And he's coming off a bad game. Just 3 fantasy points in Week 7 against the Texans. Good game script. Lots of points in that game, but just 4 targets, 2 receptions, 10 receiving yards, and we saw a lot of involvement out of Romeo Dobbs. We saw Tucker Kraft score. We saw Dontavion Wick score. Didn't see a lot of Christian Watson, but there is volatility with this receiving room. But I just want to remind you guys that the most consistent receiver on this team all season long has been Jayden Reed, and he is still a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. So I know it was a down week, but outside of Week 2 when Jordan Love wasn't even playing, and this past week, he has 10 or more fantasy points in every single matchup this season with a ceiling of 33.1 fantasy points, averaging 15.6 fantasy points per game. So you own Jayden Reed. Don't think about benching him. Not against the Jacksonville Jaguars, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. This is going to be a game with points. I mean, the interesting thing about the Jaguars is they can find a way to stay in games and score some points themselves, even if they're struggling offensively, but the defense is just so bad. There's no hope, but it makes for a very good overall game script in terms of fantasy point potential. So you own Jayden Reed. Don't read into things too much here with Romeo Dobbs having, 2 good weeks now and the volatility in this wide receiver room. Jayden Reed is still the wide receiver that you want to own from a fantasy perspective when it comes to the Green Bay Packers, and he is a smash play against the Jaguars in Week 8. All right, next up, he's back, ladies and gentlemen. He said it himself, and Tua's back as well, which means Tyreek Hill is back here in Week 8 in a good matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. It's a home game for the Dolphins. I know the Cardinals came to play against the Chargers, but it's a little bit of a different overall team, right? And ultimately, I'm not worried too much I have a little bit of concern here for the Dolphins this week, but I think they're going to bounce back in nice fashion with Tua back at the quarterback position. I think Tyreek Hill could be set for a big game this week against the Cardinals. I know it's been a very tough stretch. We only have one double-digit fantasy performance since Tua went down with a concussion in week 2. But he's going to be back, and he's going to give you a double-digit fantasy performance this week. If you're on the fence about starting Tyreek Hill in Tua's first start back, I would not be. I think that Hill's going to bounce back nicely here. I think Jalen Waddle could bounce back nicely. I think Devon Achane could have a good day as well. I think this is going to be a good overall offensive performance for the Dolphins. And once again, I think the Cardinals can fight back a little bit in this game. Kyler Murray, James Conner match up nicely against this Dolphins defense right now. Maybe a little bit worried about the wide receivers, but we've got Trey McBride there as well. So overall, this should be a pretty good offensive day for both teams, and I'm expecting a big performance out of Tyreek Hill. This is what we've been waiting for. If you traded for Hill, if you held on to him, the time to start Tyreek Hill is now. Don't leave him on your bench in week 8. Next up is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, who when we last saw in action in week 6 against the Jaguars in a smash spot, was pretty quiet. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 20 receiving yards. Got a little bit banged up in that game. Just 6 fantasy points, but he's healthy. Was able to return in that game. Then they had the week 7 bye. So I don't know, you might be looking at your options and just not super excited about DJ Moore, but DJ Moore has still been great, averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season. Double digits in every game this year, except for week 6 against the Jags. And he just wasn't even really necessary in that game. I mean, Cole Kmet was balling. Keenan Allen was balling. DeAndre Swift was having a good day. Overall, I think DJ Moore on the road here against the Commanders. And, I will note that the Commanders' defense is just, they're not really one of these defenses that we can just kind of look at and say, yeah, let's start whoever we want to against them anymore. Dan Quinn has got this unit playing pretty well, but they also haven't faced the steepest competition in the past 2 weeks with the Panthers and the Browns. So, the Bears have had their own struggles this season, but they looked very good the last couple of weeks right before the bye. So I do like DJ Moore a lot this week. For some of your guys' rosters out there, he's like your wide receiver 3 or whatever. I think DJ Moore continues to be just a solid start, safe floor, good ceiling, good matchup this week. I think, coming out of the bye week, they're going to have DJ Moore involved in their game plan right away. So if you own DJ Moore, do not bench him. It's a good matchup, and this game could get a little bit wacky if Jaden Daniels does not start at quarterback for the Commanders, and we might see a pretty good outing for the Bears. So you own DJ Moore, keep him in your lineups. He's a smash play in week 8. Usually I would go over 4 running backs and 4 wide receivers for this video, but I want to throw tight end in here. So we got 3 wide receivers and 1 tight end, and that tight end is Tucker Kraft of the Green Bay Packers. Now, a lot of you guys watching this are going to say, yeah, if I got Tucker Kraft, I'm starting him. Like, this is pointless, but see a lot of rosters, see a lot of teams out here in the community, and a lot of you guys have Tucker Kraft as a tight end too. And I think Tucker Kraft this week could be a flex play and should be a starting tight end. I think he's in a very, very good position as the Jaguars are giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the tight end position. We've talked about this unit against tight ends the past 2 weeks. Talked a lot about Hunter Henry going into week 7. He had 17.2 fantasy points against the Jaguars. And the week before that, we talked about Cole Kmet, who had 24 fantasy points against this unit. They have been a funnel for the tight end position. And now we got Tucker Kraft coming off of a game where he scored a touchdown, 12.3 fantasy points, just 4 targets, 3 receptions. For the most part, over the past 4 weeks where he has scored 4 touchdowns, the volume's been relatively low. And I talked about that, kind of being a little bit cautious going into week 6 against Arizona. Like, we take away these touchdowns, what are we really left with? And he didn't score that game and had just 3.5 fantasy points. But he is in position to score again here in week 8. I know a lot of these kind of tight ends, like if they don't score a touchdown, there's very few tight ends right now that are getting the volume where they can get you double-digit fantasy points without a touchdown. But I'm not worried about it this week. Tucker Kraft comes in as the tight end 3 right now in fantasy football, averaging 10.2 fantasy points per game. I think there's even potential here that he doesn't score, but he sees the volume because this Jags defense just cannot defend the tight end position. It is ridiculous. So whether he scores, whether he sees the volume. I know we got Josh Jacobs here. He's going to have good opportunities. We just talked about Jayden Reed. The wide receivers for this team are going to have good opportunities. But Jordan Love should have himself a day. It's a road game here. I think the Jags find a way to somewhat stay in this game for the most part. So Tucker Kraft should be a big part of the game plan. And this is just a smash matchup. If you own Tucker Kraft, don't bench him. And if you're in a bad enough position, I think he is flex worthy here in week 8. That'll do it for today's video. There are 8 players set to go nuclear here in week 8 of the season. Don't forget, guys, I am answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. Drop me a comment on this video. I'll answer every single comment before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. Whatever you guys need, I'm here to help you guys here in week 8. And don't forget, guys, we have everything on the channel here for week 8 of 2024 fantasy football, everything that you guys could possibly need. So make sure you guys are checking out the content, but more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.